Thank you, everyone, for coming to another Cognify Insight Network presentation. This is going to be a discussion on AI and data provenance. So, this presentation is brought to you by Cognify Insight Networks, part of Cognify Solutions. Cognify Solutions is a brand of Nexus systems that intends to bring intentional governed AI to those designing, developing, and deploying AI solutions. AI governance need not be just a box to tick or a T to cross. It can be intentional and it can be strategic. As such, in order to make that intentional strategic, we're going to bring you certain topics and presentations and a community to help explore some of these topics that others may not be, that there may not be a lot to discuss, but that will help be key differentiators or key enablers in your governance journey. As such, one of the things we'll be discussing will be data provenance for AI. We're going to have a presentation deck I will present shortly. After that, we'll have a Q&A session. All right. So, why are we here? The importance of governance in the AI space, especially as it pertains to the data that is being ingested and disseminated through it, is critical for a great many reasons. One of the things we want to be able to call out here is being, as we say routinely, is being intentional with how AI is developed and deployed, how we're using AI, how we're making sure it is a augment to an human agency and not as an abject replacement for it. One of the key critical parts of that is being intentional about the data that's coming into your system, where this came from, and what you're using it for. And that's going to be the primary topic of our presentation today. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, remarks, or anyone want to dive deeper on any of the topics that we present or discuss at our roundtables, we encourage you to reach out, join the community, schedule a discovery session. So, AI data pedigree, trustworthy inputs leading to defensible outputs. So one of the critical challenges with data flows in modern AI is ensuring that you have an understanding of the decisions your AI is making. AIs by design are black boxes. Exactly how they make their decisions is not immediately clear. However, the biggest way to influence that is how, one, of course, how you prompt this, but even beyond that, perhaps, is how it's trained and the data that it's accessing in order to produce a response to your prompt. So we'll be focusing in on that part here. We'll be going through why this is important. We'll be going through what some stages of that data that data lifecycle are. We'll be discussing, touching on what that looks like on this side of the pond and the other, and hopefully give you some adequate next steps. All right, so why pedigree matters. Well, the conversation around AI from time and time again is whose work it was trained on and what accountability is there for that. A lot of this comes down to IP. Some of this can come down to veracity. A great deal of it does come down to veracity. And ultimately, just at the end of the day, it ends up building trust with users. So as we look at the cost of that, let's consider those implications. Absent data absent any real data pedigree, absent any real citations, absent any real understanding of where that data is coming from, you're going to have users that are going to ask you hard questions, or you may be asking hard questions about the models that you're deploying, about hard questions for the vendors that you may be sourcing some of your models and AI systems from, questions about how do you trust them? How can you maintain that level of trust due to your users? How you can protect any intellectual property you're building on top of the output of these AI systems? How you can ensure privacy and compliance of information that's you may be putting into these systems and how that's being combined with other potential third-party information that may already be part of what's data flows coming into this model, and ensuring that if, this is not really an if these days, when you may ever audit your model, and if it's not a statutory requirement, we strongly advise you to start doing self-audits. Your customers may end up asking that before that becomes a statutory requirement, but plan for it, expect it. Audit your AI systems and your models. And of course, by participating in this process, ensuring that this process is built around the models that you're designing or deploying, you're going to end up having just a better operational flow as you design, deploy, and approve your AI systems, your models. Pedigree, provenance, lineage, traceability. Let us ground our vocabulary here.
Hmm.
Provenance is a explicit discussion on where the data came from and its history, kind of like art. Arts, you may look at a fine painting in front of you, but unless you know the provenance, there's really no telling whether or not that is a $1 million Van Gogh or a $15 print that came from Walmart. Knowing its origin and history is kind of important. Conversely, that can also go to help prove liability. If you are in possession of a $1 million Van Gogh and you trade it off like it's a $15 portrait from Walmart, you may have hard questions to answer on where this came from. All right. As such, lineage becomes important. The flow and transformation path of that data, kind of like family lineage, how that data came to you and what processes it was transformed by, and what's the transformation process through your systems as that makes its way to whatever ultimate purpose and destination you have for that data. Traceability is going to be how you ensure that any step along the way of that lineage, that of that data lineage that may have been transformed, especially through ETL processes, extract, transform, load processes. You want to make sure that you have auditability and visibility into that process, and that's verifiable. This is important from a traceability aspect, especially as we start talking about any AI systems that are handling any data that has any high value to it at all. An excellent example are medical systems where you might be handling PHI, or even systems that are modifying personal identifiable information, financial information, any of that that is normally tracked and changed when a person modifies that. You may say, of course, we have traceability into the accuracy of when this was modified and why and how. It is critical that the same level of traceability, the same level of visibility is applied in the AI systems that you may be deploying. And of course, all of this can really be summed up in the pedigree of that data, the complete documented history of all this, cobbling together its provenance, its lineage, and the verification and the accuracy of that is traceability. All right. So as we look at that in a data lifecycle, provenance, origin and intake, lineage, transformation and the processing, traceability, the verification and the auditability of that, and having it collated into a pedigree, the complete record of that data lifecycle. So what does that look like when we start looking at the AI lifecycle as we start to prep our models? All right. Depending on whether or not you're designing and training this model from scratch in-house, or whether or not you're acquiring this from a vendor, this might look different. But let's
Sure.
just look at this and see where this applies. So, what does that data pedigree look across the AI lifecycle? So for intake, data that is being consumed inside of the machine learning lifecycle, depending on where you're beginning on that. Make sure that you have license to use that data. Make sure you have some initial documentation of where that data came from, who gathered it, how it was gathered, the size, scale, and scope of that data. Just some fundamental intake on that. All right. Two, to make sure that you curate and label that data, that there's, as it's now entered into your scope of management, as it were, you're now its curator. Um, I might be so bold as to say that you should treat it like fine wine, like a fine piece of art. Your data is important. It is how your model understands the world. It may be simple, it may be complex, but it is important that your interaction with it remains intentional. How it's transformed, any other way it may be hashed, any time you may need to modify it to put it in a particular type of format that may be the best fit for your model, for the best fit for your particular system of which you're using this data. And ensure that's properly documented as well as you go into the training and fine tuning process. Ensure that the one of the outputs from this is going to be your model card, having some clear documentation on how this model works and what it was trained on and how. Include notes on where the intake of that data, and that it is part of the that system, your system score documentation. All right. Evaluation. As you're going forth and evaluating the process, the output of your model, because this is most during that training process is most likely going to be a tight loop. Ensure that if you're updating your data ingest in that process, which you very well might be, more than likely are, that that's properly logged and documented as well. Further, as you go and ultimately move to deploy that model, ensure that you are testing its output according to the data that you're expecting. This is should be part of your normal testing process for this particular model for your particular deployment. But routine testing, don't just unleash it either internally or on the masses. Be intentional about the testing, be intentional about how you're prompting it and how the output you're expecting. If you've been doing training and fine tuning, this should already be part of your methodology. If, however, you are accepting a model from a vendor, part of this life cycle may be opaque to you, but the testing of this during deployment is a piece of control we would strongly recommend that you implement and take with some real intentionality. It's going to be part of your due diligence of accepting that work product, that model, that deployment, that system from that vendor. All right, whether or not that's just a model itself or it's a whole system, be intentional about how you're testing it, how you're prompting it, what you're expecting to get out of it, and be intentional about the questions around that data. Because if part of this process is opaque to you, it becomes all that much more important to communicate with your model vendor, with your AI system vendor about how they walked through this process. And ideally, they should have artifacts and things you can inspect from each step along this way as well. All right, we go next card. So, a bigger picture, why this might be important. Two big things, two reoccurring themes we see in the regulatory space and among end users: privacy and intentionality. Is there information being used in an AI system, and are they being subject to the decisions of an AI system as opposed to a human? This is something that we see show up and mostly across the board. In the EU, some common principles of the governance they're looking for is that you have a governance system in place, that you are being intentional about the data that is being used in your systems. As such, the GDPR speaks strongly here, especially for anything that touches personal data in the from an aspect, a perspective, and framing of user privacy. The GDPR is one of the strongest privacy pieces of privacy regulation globally, and it is not blind to the advent of AI. So that's something that if you are operating in the EU space or you intend to operate in the EU space, we would encourage you to have a conversation with your local privacy experts with our partners or with us to see what some of those next steps are to help you tighten that up. And of course, high-risk systems require documentation. And one of the biggest aspects of that documentation of how systems that are designated high risk that have high impact, that they're what they're trained on and data that's coming in and out is well documented. Here in the United States, we have the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology AI Risk Management Framework. This is one of the prevailing standards. It's not quite as prescriptive as other frameworks out there, but is an excellent holistic work and should be one of the foundational pieces of how you're establishing your AI governance, your internal AI governance posture. It's one of the things that we hang our hat on in addition to ISO 42001 and its series. As such, it takes more of a principle approach of what core principles, what core aspects of your AI system and its the risk management are most relevant to you, and what standard of care is going to be most applicable inside of your environment. And there's, as such, we have a little bit more the current posture that this administration has taken as of April, anyhow, that there's going to be a more of a focus on there not really being any, let's say this neutrally, that there being a clear road with little obstacles to implementing um, high trust AI systems.
Hmm.
And as such,
Isn't that
the
an oxymoron, though, Chris? I trust AI systems.
it's a well, let's say that it's a process. It's a process that we hope some good governance can help to ensure is a fruitful process. I think that may be a fair diplomatic way to put that. And in even in Canada, uh, AI and privacy obligations and statutes are starting to emerge. Canada also has a strong strong positions on user privacy. So your any steps you take in that direction, especially if you target the EU, will serve you well in the Canadian regulatory space. And Canada also seeks to be more aligned with prevailing international standards. And more countries are starting to look at, again, GDPR being one of the gold standards of privacy legislation, are going to start looking at that as a template. That being said, there is a standard that is put out by ISO, the International Standards Organization. One of the ones that we happen to use as a solid foundation next to the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, and that's ISO 42001. That is globally recognized. It's from ISO, their global standards organization. They are private, not statutory. However, the guidance that they put out tends to be looked at very closely whenever a regulatory body starts putting their own guidance out. It tends to align with ISO standards if the ISO has put out a standard ahead of time and it's already being accepted, which in this case, it mostly is. So that's a good lowest common denominator, as it were. So let's look at the data set pedigree card. You know, I would call this perhaps your data's passport. Let's look at the source, licensing, and consent of your data, of that particular data set that you have. Where did it come from? How was it licensed? Was there consent? Especially if there's any aspect of personally identifiable information in that data. If this is part of a training set for a model that's supposed to make decisions about your customer base, how was that data sourced? Was there consent to use that data? And if you're a really important piece here, especially if you transact outside of the United States, is that if this model was trained on user information at a different firm, there needs to be an implied link for the privacy consent from that user to that firm to give that data to you. That also means that if you are putting information into a model that is now training on that, say, that user's data, and you allow a third party to use this model, that has the same requirement for you to inform the user to give consent for that model, their data, to be used by a third party. Good reminder here to tighten up your privacy policies. Demographics and coverage, especially in the case of users, what population is presented, geographic scope, sample size. A lot of this does speak to being intentional about your data's provenance for statutory sake, for privacy sake, but this is also can be very important understanding this based on just the usage of your data, its applicability. There's a case that we that I cite sometimes where a mortgage firm had implemented a machine learning system to help make decisions about um, mortgages. The problem was that the information that that system was trained on went back, and this was here in the United States, so this is a bit more culturally specific, but the geographic scope and population represented in this. This was a collection of data that was of mortgage data of lending that was collected over the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, going back. The problem is that historical snapshot of data had a certain bias that was built into it. And absent the understanding and the documentation of that, of the bias, or at least the cultural implications of that, of how that data was collected, suddenly that model, that system was now bringing back the same practices that were in place, redlining at the time that data was collected. That is a reputational risk I don't think anyone on this call or watching this replay would be comfortable with. If you are comfortable with that, we need to have a different conversation. So
Or,
again,
or it's
indeed,
part of making America great again.
part of a different conversation. Known limits and biases in that same vein, documented limitations, potential biases, and exclusions. So in that, if that data set was properly documented, as we just discussed, that may have been able to be accounted for. Perhaps there was some historical aspect of that that would have actually been useful to apply in an inverse way. Perhaps that would have been a good auditing data set to be able to check against the way that their current models were, excuse me, to check against the way their current models were being implemented. That's actually a very valid use case as long as you're aware and it's documented and you can understand the implications of using that data. It's part of doing this with intentionality. PII, personally identifiable information, ensuring that if you need a statistically relevant data set, but you absolutely do not need any identifiable information. You don't need any PII there. Have you taken enough steps to ensure that it has been sufficiently anonymized and that there are safeguards in place to ensure that any new data or any cross-reference data won't suddenly de-anonymize that? If I give you a collection of addresses in a neighborhood, that may be sufficiently anonymous. But if now I give you a collection of um, traffic patterns in and out of that neighborhood to specific spots, and maybe there's a geolocation, a geocoordinate link to that, that's not just traffic flows that say, oh, this is how the car movement during an afternoon. Suddenly I may know that this particular house arrives at the folks of this particular house arrives and leaves at this particular time. That's highly sensitive and very identifiable. But unless you're intentional about how some of this information can be linked together, you might do this by accident. So it's important to ensure that safeguards, being intentional about this, are in place as you're mixing different data sets. All right. Collection context as well. What methodologies, timeframes, circumstances of data collection were put into place at that time. It can be important to understand how that was collected. Again, easily goes back to inform the origin licensing of that. All right. If I collected data one way, I may have had consent for that as opposed to it being another way. There are many examples of data being used, data collected in a sufficient way being sufficient for one purpose in your model, but not another. Continuing on, again, if you are doing fine training of your model, then a lot of this should be very familiar, such as labeling and being intentional about its quality assurance. And as you're making transforming that data and versioning it, if you are not, if you are consuming a model that has been pre-trained, again, these are questions that you want to ask your vendor. Ask them about what type of quality assurance they had for data that was ingested into it. Ask them about the type of transformation that may have occurred on that data in that model. Depending on your vendor and depending on the data, this might be a new conversation. The vendor may be able to make certain assumptions and presumptions about where their data initially came from, but may not have made detailed records on how they transformed it while it was moving through their model. This is not necessarily a red flag, but it is a conversation to have with your vendor. And retention and disposal. Many pieces of information, especially if it's specifically licensed, may have a term on that usage. Ensure that there is an, excuse me, ensure that there is an understanding of how to remove that information. And the way a lot of models are trained, that may not be clear or easily possible or readily possible. And if that's the case, you need to have a process in place on retiring models with outdated and unlicensed data inside of them. If you have this process, if you have this intentionality in place up front and have these conversations with your model vendors, this will avoid very difficult, very hard conversations or a temptation to overlook this on purpose later on, which of course we would strongly advise against. So, enabling your pedigree at scale. Some quick notes and recommendations, ensuring that you have a data catalog and lineage of your data, that you have a pedigree system, as it were, to inventory and map this. If you are doing fine tuning, ensure that your experiment tracking is being done with intentionality. Ensure that you are properly logging and evidencing the experiments you're doing during your your fine tuning process. Policy as code. Ensure that perhaps you have a system, such as the gateway product that we have, that to automatically do testing and quality assurance of these systems on a routine basis, that ensure that certain governance rules are implemented consistently and verifiably. And of course, again, in the C2PA space, where we're discussing how mostly AI data is watermarked. That's going to be the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. That's absolutely going to be informative on properly tagging data that's coming out of your system, because you may have certain provenance obligations for it coming out, especially for certain types of user-generated content, certain user-generated media that is being reconsumed. It's going to be important, increasingly so. The public has shown no signs of coming off the position of want to know, we need to know when we're consuming information that is AI generated, no matter how realistic it is. So C2PA, content credentials, and watermarking and fingerprinting are going to be more important here. All right. Let's go to the next card here. Synthetic data. It's going to be important to point this out here, because a clear question may be, the data that we have we've generated internally. We're using it to simulate. We don't have these as many obligations because we're not really using real data. This is not necessarily bad. This is actually a very good move. And if you're doing this, fantastic. If you're not, we'd love to have a conversation with how you can do this. However, it does not it does not deobligate you from every good piece of governance from good governance. In this case, you need to ensure that the data that you're generating has some basis in reality. Otherwise, it's noise. And you probably don't want to train your model on even more randomness and noise. The point of training
Right.
your model with synthetic data is probably going to be to help ground it on a simulation, a simulacrum of reality, which means that certain biases or quality issues that your synthetic data may be inspired by needs to be examined and taken accounted for as well. Ensure you have a process in place for detecting and measuring that. Again, some of this is not necessarily able to be completely eliminated, but with intentionality, if you ensure it's well documented and understood, you can avoid making certain assumptions or being having you or your product being placed in certain positions that end up in a place you did not expect to be. Again, as we've mentioned a few times during this presentation, having a conversation with your vendor, having a due diligence conversation with your vendor should be very fruitful. You should be able to go and have an honest conversation and ask them about a great deal of steps in this process. Again, either if their answer is no, or they don't have an answer, this is not necessarily a red flag, but it should be a yellow flag in the play, a sign that a conversation needs to be had. Well, why might that have been the case? What mitigated steps were in place at the time for them to make that decision? If this was not a controlled decision, well, it's being captured now. What mitigative steps can be taken now to either correct that or document it so that the assumptions that the vendor is selling you and that you're accepting are well understood. So have that conversation about where the data set came from and licensing of that. Have a conversation about the collection methods around that data. Have a conversation around the bias and quality of that data. Have a conversation about how they fine-tune their model based on that. Have a conversation about the certain detection methodologies they use in order to figure out, in order to test what data should or shouldn't have been in there and have a conversation about their general documentation process for their model. As this model is updated with new data, are you made aware of that? Do you get access to a change log of that? Or do new models and new data just show up in your deployment unbeknownst to you? That is a red flag. All right. And as such, if they're going to participate in that process, if they're going to participate in that audit process, fantastic. Is there an SLA for that? Is there any type of guarantee for that? If a vendor says, fantastic, you're asking great questions, we want to support you in this, we want to be able to provide routine answers that you're comfortable with. Beautiful. Are they going to is that going to be lip service? Or is that going to be something that can be part of your negotiated contract, part of a standing part of the relationship with your particular vendor? All right. So just as a mental map, just as a exercise, consider what happens in the scenario where there's no pedigree for the data in a particular model. In this case, we have a marketing team. They request an AI generated image. This model generates a image from the training data that it has. This image is published in a major campaign. However, it's now challenged in court. Perhaps even suit is brought because it's been detected to be strongly derivative of unlicensed source material. That campaign is pulled, the reputation of that firm is damaged, and this quite possibly has now been opened to significant financial risk uh, damages. However, if you are intentional, let's walk that through. If you are intentional with a pedigree of the data in your model, say that marketing team does that same thing. They request an AI generated image. By checking the pedigree of this, they're able to verify that, hey, it was based on source images, source data, where there's a license gap here. Okay, maybe that means we don't have to abandon it. Maybe this now means we can properly fingerprint it and tag it, leading this back to the original source it came from, hopefully with consent. But at the very least, there's a attribution as part of that fingerprinting. Now that means they can go to market with a little bit more confidence and an audit trail to boot. So we would say in this case, hopefully this has been a great amount of helpful and valuable information. Some quick KPIs we would say is plan a phased approach in 30, 60, and 90 days. Ensure that you can start small, but that you have some coverage with some of these tools and move to increase them over time so that you can ensure that you're collecting some data sheets of your data, you're collecting some lineage of your data, you're collecting some licenses of your data sets that you are actually moving to try to audit them, and you're getting better at trying to audit that data and its use in your outputs. That as you start to measure the responsiveness of that and the assets that you have that are appropriately tagged, especially if you're using the C2PA content credentials, that type of fingerprint and watermarking, um, that you actually start moving to implement that. Now, one of the things I would recommend is start, if this seems ambitious, that's fine. You can start, excuse me. If this seems ambitious, that's fine. You can start smaller. You can start on a longer initial time scale. You can start focusing on one aspect of this. But if you need any help on establishing this, we would say give us a call. We'd be glad to have a conversation with you to discuss what this deployment looks like, what this type of effort looks like in your environment, according to your specific deployment, or even join the community. Please feel free to jump in there and ask any specific questions you may have. All right. So I would say, as a show of hands, is your organization ready for a data audit? If there are, that's fantastic. I see we had a couple hands go up, a hand go up, and that's perfectly fine. Not everybody is. And if you're not, I would say start to consider how you can prove what type of governance can be put into place to prove license and consent compliance. I would also say, and I would say put this in the chat, or if you're looking at this offline, um, where's your biggest data lineage blind spot? And consider what of that in your lineage readiness should you prioritize? It's going to be unique to your deployment. That would be an excellent discussion to have. Um, I think there might be some interesting things popping off in chat. I'll look forward to engaging on that and in the comment section where this video is posted. So again, I would leave you with these next steps to adopt some of these pedigree guidelines, pick a use case of pilot, and run with it. Take that pilot into a 30-day period. If you have any questions on how to move forward with that, there should be links in the chat. There should be links in the description and down below in the community of how to get in touch with us, or just where you can post some questions, and we'd love to interact with you and follow up with you in that way. And that being said, I'm going to open this up to a general Q&A if we have any questions from the audience.
It's more of a comment, Chris. As I was listening to this whole notion of AI data pedigree, I deal with a lot of law firms. So what kind of resonated to me is it's kind of a combination of, when you receive a document digitally, there's certain metadata elements
Mhm.
that are incorporated into that, but it
Yeah,
doesn't include everything that you identified in data pedigree, such. Um, but it is in essence also kind of an extension of a chain of custody. You know,
precisely.
kn-
Yes,
knowing where that data comes from, who's touched it, who has modified it, um, how it's been, and how it ultimately resides in its final destination point, perhaps in your document management system or your large language model or your private small language model, whatever that may be.
indeed.
So I guess the question is, because we talk a lot about frameworks and certainly in the AI governance space, is is there something that occurs to you in terms of how we can intermediate inbound data or inbound documents to kind of superimpose these data pedigree standards and to ensure that maybe it gets tagged with this throughout its existence and life cycle in an organization?
That is an awesome question. Um, I would say a lot of things can be examined through a back to basics approach. How's that data coming in? Is that data landing in a document management system first before it reaches out to um, is that data landing in a document management system first before it's being ingested into your model inside of your AI system? And it should be. It should be before it you consume that in any other kind of into your AI management system. Ideally, that should have been say if that went directly into your staff's hands, that went into some other document library, that maybe went to your data warehouse or your data your statisticians team or person. There would have been some accounting for that. Now, the way we have some of these models set up um, that there's an implication that there's an implic. Well, let me mute this. There's an implication that the model will just ingest it. It'll just be automatically uploaded for RAG, and we could do fine-tuning experiments for it. And they'll be put into our retrieval system, and it'll just pop up. And no, no, that needs to be an intentional process. That absolutely needs to be an intentional process. So I would say that find ways of which you would have tagged that data originally and do that and be intentional about that.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Indeed.
So, a question I was just kind of bouncing around or chatting about in the chat here was the blind spots. I think that's a great question because it's easy to overlook that because you don't see it. So I was thinking about the perspective of someone from the outside looking in, having trusted team or person, that can look over this and make sure that you don't have any blind spots. But would that be something that an individual or organization could reach out to Cognify to maybe get you guys to take a look and ask some questions to help them identify those potential blind spots?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I see this as part of an assessment process. You
Yeah.
really need to go into an organization and really unearth what their current process is in terms of uh, attempting to have whether they have an AI data pedigree, what pieces they have, what's missing. I mean, the thing that strikes out to me quite a bit is we live in a world today where truth is elusive and facts are elusive. um, I know in the legal space that might be a little bit lesser of the case because testimony can be refuted and and factually checked a little bit easier in a courtroom than in the courtroom of public knowledge, shall we say, where there's a great deal of pollution, bias, meandering, and so forth. So this really becomes more critical, given our life use cases these days and where we get our data, where we get our information. Because we're moving in societal directions that don't place as much of a premium on facts and the truth anymore. But businesses, organizations, law firms, accounting firms, people out there need that, because you can't run a business on bias and innuendo and falsehoods and so forth.
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
how often should audits take place?
I would say that is a flexible question. There's certainly some organizations with some deployments that with certain high impact that may need to be auditing on a quarterly basis or more often. A thorough audit, soup to nuts, in this data, and as far as data pedigree goes, I'd say I'd be hard pressed to say this should be done a thorough audit more often than once a month, and that's a big lift. Um, at that point, I would say you need to make sure your governance is a ongoing, is it has a continual aspect to it. What steps, what like continuous improvement, like iterative improvement, what of your governance process can you routinely do regularly?
Right.
Um, and certainly there are some organizations out there that I would say as a default to do this no less often than once a year, perhaps
Yeah.
twice a year. Anytime there are significant changes to your process, anytime there's significant changes to your risk posture, anytime as part of that, anytime there's significant changes to um, your vendor relationship, if this is an external model, or again, to how you're training your model, if you're pulling this inside, that's a time you need to do another audit. But that's some general guidelines right there.
Yeah. But my thinking is, again, back to my question before about what kind of construct or what kind of framework you can put in place. If you can do that on a continuous basis, then you can just throw up a dashboard that flags all the exceptions, all the violations, all of the lack of compliance areas, and just focus on that. Because inevitably, surrounding large language models or document repositories and things of that nature, they're massive. So we need to focus on the exceptions, not the
Yeah.
balance. And if we focus just on the exceptions, we can do that more readily and more frequently if we have that engine running all the time. I agree, audits can't obviously be done at that level of frequency, but this information would feed into the audits ultimately and make the auditing process more visible, more transparent, and easier to produce, for those occasions.
Is this another thing that people would reach out to you guys to ask about? Let's say, someone's starting a business, they are using AI, but they're not necessarily sure based on the type of business they run or the type of information they collect, how often they should be auditing. It seems like, or it sounds to me like this is a really it can be flexible depending on what you're doing. So is that something else that people could ask about?
Yeah. To me. Absolutely. If they're not sure what their risk posture is, there absolutely should be a conversation.
Yeah.
We'd love to explore that with them. It may be more than they think. It could be less than they think. A lot of times you won't know unless you look. It's like it's like getting a warranty on your car or even homeowner's insurance. It's going to be awful hard to maybe not even maybe you can get a policy and they never come out to the house. But it's awful hard to understand the real impact of that policy if you never walk the house. What those risks may be a lot more than you think, maybe a lot less than you think. But otherwise, whatever either literal insurance or peace of mind you think you have won't be grounded in any truth if you don't actually have the conversation and take a look.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to Brittany's earlier point about blind spots, that they have to be continually explored, as certainly in this space. And that really harkens back to the necessity to really do an initial assessment, see what those blind spots are, see where the weak points are, the vulnerability points are, and then, address them in creating this kind of a framework around this.
Indeed. 100%. All right. Well, is there one? Are there any more questions? That
Yep.
being said,
Great presentation. Thank you.
indeed. So I thank you today. I thank everyone who has come in person. I thank everybody who is joining us on the replay for your time and for your attention. If you have any questions, if you'd like more information, if you'd like to discover how we can support you with our solutions and products, please, we encourage you to reach out. Find us online at cognifysolutions.ai. Please feel free to reach out, join the community, look for a link to book a discovery call, or to get any additional resources related to this presentation by looking in the links below. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
All right.
And that's a wrap.